From here we can ask ourselves the questions that really interest us. Where and when were cats domesticated? And how did they end up becoming pets distributed all over the world? Well, let's start with what was believed until now. The existing evidence pointed to two main centers of domestication, the Neolithic Levant and Pharaonic Egypt. The first focus corresponded to the hypothesis of the origin of the domestic cat in the Near East. According to this idea, the domestication of the cat began in the Neolithic, about 9,000 years ago, in a region of the Levant that we could place near present-day Syria. Actually, this made quite a lot of sense since it would coincide with the emergence of agriculture. This is when villages began to store grain, which attracted rodents, and these in turn attracted wild cats that found in them an easier prey. Thus would have begun the mutually beneficial relationship between humans and cats. And as these Neolithic farmers colonized part of the Mediterranean and moved towards Europe, the cats accompanied them, probably as pest controllers. And what scientific evidence did we have for this hypothesis? Well, the main one was an archaeological find on the island of Cyprus, dated about 9,500 years ago. You see? Here we can see a cat buried next to a human. Although, well, there was also genetic evidence. Different remains of Neolithic cats were found in areas of Turkey and the Balkans from about 6 years ago that had genetic traces of African wildcat. Remember that this is the ancestor of the domestic cat, so it made sense to conclude that these cats had reached Europe thanks to humans. But it turns out that no, because this is when the recent article we told you about comes into play and completely changes the story. The thing is that previously, scientists could only analyze a small part of the DNA of these remains, and that led to confusion. In this new research, their DNA was analyzed completely, that is, their genome, and the result was very clear. The cat remains we have told you about correspond to Felis sylvestris, that is, the wild cats that are native to Europe, and these have nothing to do with domestic cats. Remember, domestic cats come from the African wildcat, Felis libica. So, to summarize, basically we have been left without scientific evidence to support the origin of domestic cats in the Neolithic. Okay? So we are left with the second possibility that was proposed, Egypt. Traditionally, Pharaonic Egypt has been considered the main cradle of cat domestication, and the core from which it spread throughout the ancient world. According to this hypothesis, it was in the Nile Valley where the African wildcat completed its domestication process, giving rise to the domestic cat Felis catus about 3,500 years ago. Cats were fundamental in the Egyptian agricultural economy as pest controllers in granaries. But in addition, there's abundant evidence that in Egypt a very close relationship developed between humans and felines. For example, there are paintings in tombs where cats are represented with earrings and collars eating from plates or sitting under the chair of the lady of the house. This indicates that they had gone from being working animals to beloved pets, that is, members of the family. And of course, we also have to talk about what probably drove this close relationship, the religious importance of the cat. The most notable example is the cult of Bastid, one of the most famous goddesses who was worshipped throughout much of ancient Egypt, the one who was represented with a cat's head. In fact, there's the hypothesis that the cat may have been domesticated, at least in part, through these religious practices. If something characterized the Egyptians, it was that they did not spare offerings, so millions of cats were mummified and offered to the gods. This involved the breeding of cats in enormous quantities, a process that probably favored the most docile, sociable individuals accustomed to human presence. Okay, is the very important role that the Egyptians had in domesticating cats clear? The big question is whether the process started with them, and it seems not, or at least it seems that it also occurred in other regions. Current evidence shows that domestic cats have a greater genetic affinity with the African wildcat from the North African region, present-day Tunisia. This means that cities like Carthage, the great Phoenician city of the Mediterranean, could also have been a very important center of domestication. We can propose the hypothesis that Egypt was a kind of finishing school, that is, cats were already living near humans in other parts of Africa. And it was in Egypt when they finished developing their sociable behavior before being exported to the rest of the world. Because this has to be our next question. When did cats begin to move across the rest of the planet? This is where, of course, the Roman Empire enters the scene about 2,000 years ago. And there are remains of domestic cats in military camps throughout Europe. This suggests that Roman soldiers carried the kitties with them, probably to control rodents and grain rations. Of course, there is also evidence of domestic cats in Roman villas and ports, so everything points to them being fully integrated into the daily life of the empire. By the way, we can finally clarify the origin of some very special cats, the Sardinian cats. You see, on the Italian island of Sardinia, there's a population of wild cats that has puzzled scientists for decades. They are not traditional European wildcats, nor of course are they feral domestic cats that recently escaped from home. They are a kind of feline missing link. Now we know that these felines also descend directly from the African wildcat, However, there is a surprising twist. They belong to a different lineage from that of the domestic cats we know today. They are the descendants of what was actually the true first wave of cats that came to Europe from Africa. They were introduced to the island by some of the peoples who navigated the Mediterranean during the first millennium before Christ. And once in Sardinia, this population settled and prospered independently. Cool, right? By the way, what about Asia? We know that in China, humans have lived with cats for more than 5,000 years. Don't worry, we have not made a mistake with the date. Everything makes sense. Now we know that, in reality, it was a completely different animal. We are talking about the leopard cat, or Prion bengalensis. It is so different from domestic cats that they do not even belong to the same biological genus. In reality, this small Asian wild feline was never completely domesticated, and it seems that modern domestic cats did not reach China until just 1,300 years ago during the Tang Dynasty, probably through the Silk Road. In this way, after the arrival of Western cats, the leopard cat disappeared from coexistence with humans until being completely replaced. And what about America? Well, they arrived with European colonizers from the 15th century onward. In fact, it is quite likely that they arrived from the beginning with Christopher Columbus, since at that time it had to be practically impossible to successfully make a transoceanic journey without cats on board, because wooden ships loaded with provisions were magnets for rats and mice. Obviously, this does not mean that in America there were not previously small felines like the ocelot or the margay, but these were never domesticated. In summary, although the history of the cat with us is shorter than we think, it is still very intense. Little by little, they slipped into farms, villas, and cities, into military camps, and onto ships, until becoming what they are today, the owners of your home. After centuries of coexistence, the modern cat seems to be summarized in two possible states. Either it is an irresistible little ball of love, or it watches you with that fixed gaze that makes you suspect that secretly it is planning your murder. And that is all for today's video, friends. What did you think of the story of your cat's ancestors? If you liked it, do not forget to give us a like and follow the channel. You know that it is very important so that we can continue creating this type of content. Many of you will have a cat at home, so tell us in the comments the mischief they prepare for you, which surely are very funny. See you in the next video.